Hello. I'm so glad to welcome everybody to the launch of the report, Exporting Extinction, How the International Financial System Constrains Biodiverse Futures. I'm Thea Riofrancos, and I'll be sort of moderating today's proceedings. I'm a strategic advisor for the Climate and Community Project and an associate professor of political science at Providence College. This is a really fantastic and exciting new research report that was just launched today, and it is a collaboration between the Center for Climate Justice, the Climate and Community Project, and the Third World Network. And I'm just giving a few broad overview comments, and then I'll hand it over to our amazing panelists. So I think the first thing to say, as we as advocates and scholars and activists focus our attention on the climate crisis, is how deeply related the climate and biodiversity crises are. And one of the reasons that they're related is that their root causes are the same, right? They both issue from unsustainable levels of resource extraction, whether that's industrial scale agriculture, mining, oil, gas, and coal extraction, and as well as unsustainable land use patterns and deforestation, right? So those are the underlying causes of both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, which themselves interact and exacerbate one another. But this raises the key question: what causes unsustainable levels of extraction and unsustainable land use patterns, right? I think a short and easy and broadly correct answer is global capitalism and an unequal world system, right? Those are correct answers to that question. But I think, as I tell my students, like, let's be more specific, right? Like, what is it about global capitalism and about an unequal world order that drives unsustainable patterns of land use and really frightening levels of biodiversity loss, right? And so what this report does, and what I think is so important about it, is that it digs into what we might call the global political economy of biodiversity loss, because it turns out that it's financial mechanisms, it's trade mechanisms, it's the monetary system, right, that really do put especially global South governments in positions of adopting unsustainable patterns of extraction and unsustainable development models. So we're going to learn about that all in a lot more detail today. And so I'm going to now just pivot to present our guest speakers and then kind of hand it off to them to get into the arguments and also how the research report relates to their own kind of research trajectories. So first up, we'll have Jess Dempsey, who's an associate professor at the University of British Columbia, Canada, in the Department of Geography and also at the Center for Climate Justice. We will also hear from Ana Di Pangracio, who's the Biodiversity Director and the Deputy Director at the Fundación Ambiente y Recursos Naturales in Argentina. We'll have Chi Yok Ling, who's the director of the Third World Network based in Malaysia. We'll have Fadel Kaboub, who's the associate professor of economics at Denison University and also president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And finally, we'll have Audrey Irvin Broke, who's a second-year PhD student at the University of British Columbia and whose research was central to the report. So first, I'll hand it over to Jess for some overview of the report's key arguments, and then we'll hear from some of the other speakers.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Thea, for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here with some old and new friends launching this research into the world. First, just to the next slide, I need to say that this piece of work that the one before. Thanks. That this piece of work is the result of many, many researchers. The project involved a whole team of students at UBC, both undergrads and grads over a long time period. We also had a whole raft of reviewers, including 2 country experts, at least for each of the case studies. When we sent out this Google Doc for review, it was really a highlight of my working life to see it really light up with a flurry of critical and constructive comments on it. Thanks to everyone who contributed. The teams at the sponsoring organizations too, the Climate and Community Project, Patrick Bigger, Third World Network, Ling Ching, and at the Center for Climate Justice, Sarah Nelson and Katie McChesney. Next slide. So as Thea said, this research report really takes on a serious question that I think many of you in this room are interested in and actively engaged in. Why do decades of decisions and targets to address ecological degradation and biodiversity loss fail? The world's foremost experts on biodiversity and ecosystem change gathered around the IPCC of Biodiversity, the lesser known IPBES, concluded in 2019 that this is because biodiversity efforts haven't really tackled underlying or root drivers of biodiversity loss. As research and analysts, we need to sharpen our understanding of those root drivers. And as Thea really gestured to, we need to do this with some specificity, right? So how to study these kind of root drivers? There are many, many ways. Our approach for this study began from the science that shows, as also Thea said, biodiversity loss is caused by extraction, including from mining, oil and gas, forestry, and industrial agriculture. These are the direct drivers. Next slide. In an attempt to really get at these root causes with more specificities, we then asked what prevents countries from stopping or altering the extraction that imperils biodiversity? Also a big question. And because so many of the costs and benefits from these extractive activities are unevenly distributed in a formation Latin American movements and scholars term extractivism, we also wanted to explore really like what holds this formation in place, again, with some specificity. So we made this manageable by drilling into understanding one sector known to directly drive biodiversity loss in each of our case study countries. For example, by asking what holds the soy sector in place in Argentina, which Anna will take on and explore with us in just a second. We have such a short time today, so we'll look at one key figure. Oh, I should just quickly say the country case studies that we looked at. So Argentina, Colombia, Papua New Guinea, the DRC, and Jamaica. So 5 case studies. So we have a short time, so I'm going to look at one key figure that really summarizes our research findings. So next slide. It is, of course, an iceberg inspired by the late, great Maria Mies. Above the waterline are these drivers of biodiversity loss, the extraction. In the sort of meso section there, we have these things states are doing to support those direct drivers, which are substantial and entirely contra biodiversity targets. In all 5 of our case studies, we see that governments continue to approve, subsidize, and expand the extractive developments that erode biodiversity. Now, clearly, domestic political agendas play a role, including elite and regulatory capture. These are clearly explain part of what perpetuates these ongoing decisions. But our research report shows that governments are also structurally incentivized to maintain and expand these sectors by the pressures of the international financial system to maintain investability, earn foreign exchange, and to comply with international financial institutions that manage economic crises. They do all of this in part because to do otherwise would risk financial stability within a highly unequal international political economic system in which many states already struggle to pay for basic imports and services. So now our study results are specific to the countries we studied, but it is well known that these dynamics affect many countries across the global south. For decades, scholars have described global south states as subordinate in the international financial system. That is, they're structurally disadvantaged, facing ongoing economic instability and subject to constant threat of capital flight, loan defaults, and shocks based on changes to commodity prices and to monetary policy decisions made far away elsewhere. So our research really shows how this subordination generates strong incentives to expand and deepen industries most in conflict with countries' environmental objectives. These structures and the unequal pressures they exert therefore represent a significant underlying driver of biodiversity loss. Now, just in conclusion, while the role of these structural political economic pressures are really the waters that political economy scholars swim in, this analysis is pushing the narrative in the world of nature conservation and biodiversity policy circles, which typically understands the problems domestically and in terms of things like lacked finance or protected areas. These are clearly important, but they do not address underlying drivers. In conclusion, only international efforts to address these conflicting priorities undertaken in the spirit of solidarity and collective responsibility will be able to transform these structures and make viable the path towards ecological stability. How we do this is another question, but that's part of why we're here today, to begin to discuss. Thank you. And please do read the report. There's a link in the chat with where you can access it, and it will be available in Spanish and French in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jess, for providing the kind of motivations of the report and the top line findings. And I do highly recommend people read it. It is excellent. So now I'm going to sort of pass it along to our three panelists who are going to tie the report's findings and analyses to some of their own kind of research experiences on specific countries as well as at the international level. So first, we're going to hear from Anna, who's going to link the report to the current situation in Argentina with some particular attention on the relationship between international financial pressure and unsustainable soy expansion. And just to note that throughout the whole panel, please put your questions in the chat and we will get to them. So Anna, let me pass it on to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for the kind invitation to be part of this panel. The economic importance of the industrial agri-industrial sector in Argentina is undeniable, with foreign exchange earnings from exports averaging 60%. But it is a model that, due to its characteristics, has become extractivist, with some highly concentrated chains and based on the intensive use of inputs, many of them imported. It is characterized by the intensive use of land, often displacing local and indigenous communities, genetically modified organisms, agrochemicals, and large consumption of water. Being of intensive scale and technology, it demands less and less labor, displacing communities and small producers towards urban centers and affecting their culture and livelihood. It does not generate diverse food or food of quality either. It reduces it to a simple merchandise as a mere generator of foreign currency. The Argentine agro-industrial model, in which soy plays a prominent role, has negative impacts on biodiversity and human health. It is the main driver of deforestation. In the Argentine Chaco, part of the second largest forest in South America after the Amazon, almost 6 million hectares were deforested in the last 30 years. With a concentration of land ownership by large producers or national or foreign companies. Due to the alarming deforestation rates, and after a historic national campaign of CSOs, the Argentine National Parliament passed a law on native forests in late 2007. This law recognizes the multifunctionality of native forests and the environmental benefits that they provide, with full recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. It establishes two main interrelated instruments: the participatory territorial planning of native forests and a national fund for the enrichment and conservation of native forests. Deforestation decreased since the enactment of the native forest law, but has been increasing again since 2015, averaging 170,000 hectares deforested per year till 2022. All Argentine provinces, Argentina is a federal country, have their territorial planning in place, respecting the national standards brought by the national law. Some are now due because they have to update it every 5 years. And in some cases, some provinces, just recently the Chaco province, are updating their territorial planning with regressive consequences, contravening the national mandate and allowing deforestation in previously protected areas. And the role of agribusiness, the pressure, the lobby that they use plays a very relevant role in these decisions by provinces that go against the non-regression principle. The systematic underfunding of the national fund created by the native forest law has led to partial implementation of the law and poor enforcement. This fund has been given on average only 5% of what it should have been by legal mandate since its regulation in 2010. And meanwhile, Argentina subsidizes exotic plantations lacking socio-environmental standards, many times providing per hectare more funds to exotic plantations than native forests, when we have the national native forest law under finance. On the other hand, deforestation driven by soy expansion has also led to intensive livestock farming, shifting to areas where it was not present before, including the north of the country that is rich in forests, encouraged by the low price of land, and the Paraná River Delta, the biggest wetland system in Argentina associated to the Paraná River. There has been an increase in fires as a means to deforest and convert wetlands between 2020 and 2021 at the peak of the most recent fire crisis we had. More than 1.5 million hectares were lost to fire, and many times advancing with fires in areas where fire is not a natural element, so it has a severe impact not only on the health of ecosystems, but also people's health. You know, the consultations at clinics and hospitals increase enormously because sometimes it's directly impossible to breathe in nearby towns and cities. And the development of silvopastoral systems is also behind the degradation of forests and deforestation. These systems are intensive livestock and forestry production options encouraged at large scale by a national plan to which many provinces adhered. Most result in the loss of forest national natural functions and are counted by the National Environmental Authority as deforested areas. The agribusiness sector opposes also advancing important pending environmental legislation in Argentina, such as one on agrochemicals, on wetlands. This latter has a history of over 15 years at the national parliament, and it's one of the main demands of CSOs and support from organizations and societies ever increasing. And on the other hand, the agribusiness sector also supports reforms that deepen extractivism in the agricultural sector, such as reforming the fees law to provide greater certainty to companies by cutting back on the rights of rural producers. And very importantly, many of the conflicts associated with agribusiness in Argentina are a symptom of a big integral pending issue in the country that is advancing the territorial planning of the whole Argentine territory, including the sea. Conflicts and disputes over land use happen in different parts of the country, along with greater extractive pressure associated with the search to maximize profits from the private sector and to obtain foreign currency for debt repayment from the public sector. All in all, if the environmental and social externalities of the agro-industrial model in Argentina were included in the economic benefits that it brings, the numbers for the sector would be totally different. But consecutive Argentine governments have doubled down on their support for the sector and minimized or denied its negative impacts. It's not an issue that is on mainstream media, for instance, it's totally absent. Since the 1990s, regardless of political colors, governments have intentionally expanded the footprint of soy industry. Argentina's soy sector is deemed necessary because the country relies on commodity exports, its monetary system is dependent on US dollars, it carries a high external debt load, and it faces continued restructuring mandates from international financial institutions. But this economic development model has not been able to mitigate the ongoing financial and economic crisis. It is a model that exacerbates biodiversity harm and socio-environmental conflict and brings more poverty and dependence. Currently, 30% of Argentinian population is poor and 10% indigenous. In addition, the focus on export exposes the economy of the country to the volatility of global commodity prices, even more in a climate crisis. When commodity prices slump or when crop yields are low, the crisis worsens. In 2023, for instance, a historic drought reduced total exports by almost 25%. And Javier Milei taking office last December only aggravates the whole scenario. He's carrying out a severe shock fiscal adjustment, impoverishing the working class and middle class. An attempt to reform key environmental legislation regressively in the summer did not succeed in parliament thanks to the coordinated action of CSOs. However, the government is dismantling support systems, dissolving regulatory bodies, programs and plans, budget cuts, layoffs, The Ministry of Environment downgraded to an undersecretary, the lowest rank it has ever had, and eliminated the Agroecology Directorate, among others. Environmental trusts, including the one I referred to on native forests, are at risk of being eliminated through superpowers that the national parliament might be granting our president in a few days. And the latest agreement between Argentina's government and the IMF for the disbursement of 4.7 billion US dollars in January is based on the promotion of structural improvements in Argentina's energy, agricultural and mining balance to generate foreign currency, moving Argentina away from the path of energy transition and compliance with international environmental commitments. This will undoubtedly exacerbate the biodiversity crisis, and Argentina will likely be unable to meet global targets. In the very national biodiversity strategy of Argentina from 2016 to 2020, the country recognizes the difficulty of reining in the social and ecological impacts of the soy industry, pointing to that as a barrier to achieving conservation targets. But to end on a more hopeful note, before the dreadful situation we are undergoing, we believe that the global biodiversity framework brings a renovated opportunity, both at the international and national level, and offers a relevant platform for CSOs and communities and grassroots to demand effective environmental action from governments. It is necessary to rethink primary activities incorporating ecological integrity objectives, since there is no production possible with degraded ecosystems. The NBSAP should include a halt to the expansion of unsustainable and equitable production models that harm biodiversity and human rights. The conservation agenda cannot be reduced to just creating protected and conserved areas only. Addressing all direct and indirect causes of biodiversity loss has to be a priority for governments at all levels. And failure in advancing past NBSAP to a large extent was due to the lack of engagement from other agencies in the process that are actually promoting activities leading to biodiversity loss. So each agency has to make commitments and integrate biodiversity in decision-making for the general coherence of biodiversity-related policies. And finally, also the NBSAP needs a finance strategy, including repurposing harmful subsidies. It was missing in the previous one, and if you want to make the NBSAP a reality and not just a nice conservation document, you need to invest in it. And my organization fund is advocating in that sense before the NBSAP process that is currently being updated. We watchdog that it includes genuine social participation with a whole of society, whole of government and human rights-based approach, and sharing information of this process among formal and informal groups to engage so that their voices are heard and integrated into decision-making and what would it would be the renovated text of an NBSAP expected by next October. Thank you very much, and congratulations on the report.
Thank you so much, Anna. I'm going to now pass it along to Yok Ling, who's going to speak about the history of multilateralism and the implications for the research in light of that longer history. So Yok, we're eager to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thea, and good day, evening to everyone. Well, from the Old Network, we are really excited. We've had a long collaboration with Jessica and her team from the university, and also this report has given us new partners. And the key messages point to a very important intersection between the work on conservation, distributed justice, and political economy. I think this is really important. Of all, I think early last year, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, actually made a very powerful opening year speech where he said at the heart of the ecological crisis from climate change and biodiversity loss is really, the central problem is the international financial architecture. And I think we'll hear a lot more of that later from Fadel. So I was just saying that, there was probably a moment of the height of multilateralism in the late 80s into, of course, the famous 1992 Earth Summit in Brazil. So there was a moment that the recognition of the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, land degradation. So if you all surely know, we had these three so-called Rio Conventions on climate change, biodiversity, and desertification, land degradation, and a very important set of principles in the Rio Principles. And these 17 principles, at the heart of it, was really recognizing structural injustice. This is not about conservation alone. It's not just about environment. It's that if we don't fix the paradigm of development that is flawed, then we are not going to be able to save the planet from the ecological and social point of view. So that was an important recognition. And if you look at the Agenda 21 on sustainable development, also adopted at the same time in 1992, it talked about the need for paradigm change. So multilateralism was perhaps at some level at its height, where there was recognition we need to have solidarity, international cooperation, and very important that there is the historical ecological debt that the North owes to the South, from colonialism to all the unfair trade and financial rules and norms. So that was an important recognition that the United Nations, representing multilateralism, was important to set legal norms and obligations. The whole concept of common but differentiated responsibilities was very central to that multilateral set of rules which are legally binding. And what we see since then is actually a slow fragmentation and really a sort of destruction of that multilateralism. But it is not surprising, because while we had that recognition of really the drivers of climate change and biodiversity loss was recognized as structural, that there was a need for redistributive justice as well, incorporated into those agreements on biodiversity and climate change. However, at the same time, the clash of paradigm continued, because we also saw the trade agreements which went beyond trade into intellectual property that led to what we know today as the World Trade Organization and WTO rules. In that whole package of international law was very counter and clashed with the Convention on Biodiversity on Climate Change and the Rio Principles. So that clash of paradigm showed that the winner is really the flawed financial trade and investment system. And so we saw this erosion and fragmentation of multilateralism. And today we see the extreme, perhaps, is really in not just about occupation of the global space in terms of our atmosphere, pollution, loss of biodiversity. We also see war, as we see in Gaza, where really the solidarity we believed was necessary to save the world is really all about inward looking. The powerful will remain powerful, and they will not allow us to really save the planet or even humanity. So I think that stage of injustice where we are today is a challenge for us as researchers. It's a challenge for us, those of us who are in advocacy, who want to influence policy. We knew in the World Network it wasn't enough to work at the local and national level, that we really need to work at the global level because of globalization. So for 40 years, we have been able to do that, to fight the battles, and the cooperation with researchers, I think, has grown tremendously in the last 5 to 10 years. And this is really important. And I think this research, these findings and what we're going to continue doing together points us to that. Because today, extractivism is not only promoted in all the different ways that we see in the report, you can also get punished. For example, if you remember, Ecuador recently had the referendum after almost 20 years of campaigning within Ecuador and with international solidarity, decided to keep the oil in the ground. And immediately the next day, the rating agencies downgraded Ecuador's financial risk, and punished. So extractivism is celebrated, promoted, and financed and subsidized, but doing the right thing for biodiversity and climate change is punished by the financial system. And I think that really challenges all to fight, it's not about conservation, it's really about the structural injustices. So we need to go to the World Bank, the IMF, we need to go to the WTO, we need to fight bilateral investment agreements that give the rights to companies to sue governments for doing the right thing, whether it's for labor, whether it's environment. And the investor-state dispute is the worst right so-called given to corporations, and always is to protect the extraction of minerals, etc. So I think that this research is very powerful because it's making us look very hard into where the rules have to be changed. Otherwise, we will never be able to save the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for what an incredibly concise presentation covering so much ground. I really appreciate that, Yokling. So next we're going to turn to Fadel, who's going to speak to the ways that the financial system constrains sovereignty, but also how international solidarity can work across those constraints and help to solve the crisis of biodiversity loss. So without further ado, thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, congratulations on publishing this important report. I'm going to go ahead and directly build on what's been said already, and I'll put it in one key sentence, and then I'll unpack it. Well, a lot of the discussion today in the climate space is about decarbonize this and decarbonize that. And what I want to say is the following. We can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. And what I mean by that, we're talking about a global economic architecture from a global South perspective that was not designed by us, not designed for us. So it can't be the same economic architecture that will deliver justice or equity or sustainability for us. So this global economic architecture, you can think of it as four basic pillars. The first one of them is the international financial architecture. That's the World Bank and the IMF. Both designed during colonial times, by the way. Number two, you can think of the rules of 2 and 3, the rules of international trade and international investment, and that is primarily the WTO. And that's really the biggest blind spot in a lot of these conversations is about the rules of international trade and investment when it comes to extractivism and as a result, the loss of biodiversity. And then finally, it's the international taxation architecture. And that process has been in the hands of the OECD countries for the longest time until last November, when we managed to get a vote in the UN to finally move that into a UN tax convention. And that's a process that's ongoing. So that's a process of decolonizing the international taxation system. We still need to struggle to decolonize the international trade and investment architecture and the international financial architecture. So the design of this system imposed a particular role on the global South. And that can be summarized in 3 major points. Number one, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials. And that's where the extractivism is, cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output from the global North and technology from the global North. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the global North is outsourced to us under the label of development and job creation and partnership and all of that. And that's really what locks us at the bottom of the global value chain. And now I'll give you one key statistic about where we are in terms of this extractive international economic system. If you divide the world into global North and global South, and net out all global financial transactions, trade, investments, exports, imports, interest payments, debt relief, climate finance included, illicit financial flows, everything, the net amount is $2 trillion moving from the global South to the global North. That's an annual number, and that number has been accelerating over the last few years. That is, if we don't change anything about the global economic architecture, if we don't decolonize it, that number will be 4 or 5, who knows, $10 trillion a year in the future. And that is clearly unsustainable, has been unsustainable. So the question now, how does this work on a country-by-country basis? And I'll give you a few examples from the African continent just to show you the extractive nature of the economic system and how it affects biodiversity in particular through the extractive industry and agriculture in particular. So you have 3 major structural deficiencies that kind of are under the surface because everybody's focused on the external debt as the visible kind of indicator of this extractivism. Yes, external debt is extremely important, and many countries in the global South are facing a significant debt crisis as we speak, but it's actually a symptom of deeper structural issues that I can summarize in 3 points. Number one, it's food deficits. Believe it or not, the African continent today, which used to be the breadbasket for the global North, and less than 100 years ago. Today, Africa imports 85% of its food, not by accident, by design. It's the design of the rules of international trade that immediately, as soon as African countries started to gain independence, we started seeing heavy agricultural subsidies in the global North. You have the European Union Common Agricultural Policy. You have heavy agricultural subsidies in the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, and the former Soviet Union to prioritize the food sovereignty in the global north, that is producing core crops, wheat, corn, rice, barley, and so on, and to outsource the production of the cash crops to the global south. And that is large-scale industrial production for cash crops. And that's the concept of food security that was imposed on the global south at the time. And that is a key component of the loss of biodiversity, not simply because it's industrial agriculture, but because the farmers in the global south had to move away from producing their native crops, such as wheat and corn and rice and so on, and started, because it's subsidized in the north and it's cheaper to import, and they couldn't compete with that. So they had to produce cash crops for exports. And as soon as you start producing for exports, you have to use non-native seeds to serve the taste of your customers in the global north. And you have to use more fertilizers because these seeds are not acclimated to your soil, to your environment. And you have to use pesticides, so whatever you're producing can survive the journey all the way to a supermarket in the global north. And you do that for a few decades and you just burn the fertility of your soil. Your yields start to go down, and now you have to double down on using more potent seeds, more potent fertilizers and pesticides. And that is the ecological and economic devastation that we have in the global south that needs to be reversed via strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology and restructuring of the global international trade rules that govern the food system, for example. The second structural deficiency is energy deficits. And believe it or not, on the African continent, our largest exporter of oil, Nigeria, today imports 100% of its gasoline from international markets. Angola imports 80% of its fuel from international market. And again, that is by design, not by accident. And the devastation of the oil industry in a country like Nigeria alone can simply, there are no words to describe what's happening to the ecosystem, to people who can't survive past the age of 45, in Nigeria and beyond that. And then finally, the third structural deficiency is the fact that we've been forced to specialize in a kind of manufacturing that forces you to import the machine, imports the intermediate components to assemble with low-cost labor, import the fuel to power the factories, and even import the packaging. So you end up with the manufacturing base that exports low value-added content and imports high value-added content. So you can double, triple, quadruple your exports. You're always locked at the bottom of the value chain. Now, here's how it comes together. Those three structural deficits, food, energy, and manufacturing, produce an annual structural deficit, which lowers or weakens your currency relative to the dollar or to the euro, which makes everything you import the next morning more expensive. So if you're importing food or fuel or medicine, and that immediately forces governments in the global south into a defensive position, using band-aids and completely rewiring their own economic policy against biodiversity. And here's how it happens. If you have to face that weaker currency, you have to do immediately two things. Number one, we subsidize food and fuel to protect the most vulnerable. And that is an important band-aid solution in the short run, but it's not sustainable in the long run. And number two, we ask our central bankers to please stabilize the exchange rate. And they do that by borrowing more dollars and feeding the external debt. And now you're because you have external debt, because you have debt denominated in dollars to pay, every quarter, essentially. The one thing you have to do immediately is completely rewire your economy to prioritize any economic activity that will earn you dollars so you can pay the debt on time. I'll give you one example. Ethiopia today, the third largest source of export revenues after Ethiopian Airlines and after coffee, which is another cash crop, is cut flowers for Valentine's, right? One of the biggest exporters of flowers. Ethiopia today, at the same time, has 20 million people who are dependent on food aid from abroad. That is the biggest misallocation of resources. And that's a country that's blessed with fertile soil and water resources from the Nile River and so on. And Ethiopia is not unique. All of our countries have rewired their economies to prioritize exports, anything that will generate revenues. And that is the biggest loss of biodiversity in a country like Ethiopia, in a country like Kenya, and beyond. I'll give you a second example. You rewire your economy to promote tourism. I mean, why not tourism? You have millions of people coming in, bringing dollars. You have jobs created in the hotels and entertainment industry, except when you don't have food sovereignty, when you don't have energy sovereignty, and you bring 5 million tourists, you have to feed them. So you have to import more food that you don't have domestically. You have to transport them, heat and cool the hotel. So you have to import more fuel that you don't have. So it completely drives you deeper into these structural traps that have colonial origins, that have been enforced through post-colonial systems, and can only be eliminated by strategic investments in 3 areas. Number 1, food sovereignty and agroecology. And that can be done in some cases at the national level. In other cases, needs to be regional South-South cooperation. With global North cooperation, why not? And number 2, strategic investments in renewable energy sovereignty, which is Africa's biggest potential. For example, according to the International Energy Agency report from last year, Africa today, with existing technology, can produce 1,000 times its energy needs. 1,000 times. And not just for Africa, but for the rest of the world. And number 3, strategic investments in a different kind of industrialization that allows the global South to escape the bottom of the value chain. And again, none of that will happen country by country. It needs to happen via South-South cooperation with South-North solidarity and cooperation, because we're all in this structural problem. And we're all destroying the ecosystem that is the lifeblood of the economy, of society, of everything we're fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these fantastic presentations. I almost want to hear like an hour-long version of each of them, but maybe there'll be a future time for that. To start with, I'm gonna kind of bring up some questions that we've gotten from the audience, and I'm sorry, I'm just finding the first one. Yeah, so we have a couple of questions and we'll see how far we get, but let me start with the first one that we pulled from the audience, which is the following. We often talk about the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis as 2 sides of the same coin in terms of ecological breakdown. But what are the key differences? Do we risk making mistakes if we apply frameworks and lessons from decarbonization to addressing the biodiversity crisis? So I think this participant is asking us to kind of think more complexly about whether the same tools are right for both crises, or even tensions between the ways that we address each of these planetary crises. So for any of our panelists that want to jump in, the floor is yours.
Maybe I'll jump in first, Yokling here. I think that, from the report and what the panelists have highlighted, is what we see as this crisis of biodiversity and climate change is really, its root is in the economic system, right? Finance, trade, investment. And the players are becoming more and more private creditors, private corporations, private banks. And so there is no public accountability, because the biggest equity fund in the world is so opaque. You don't even know who they are, and they actually impact on our sovereignty, as Fadel said. The solutions that have been given to us from the World Bank and from the OECD, the Global North, is that you must use the market. The market is the problem in the first place. But now we are asked to look at the market to give us the solutions. So we see similar wrong and false solutions being given to deal with climate, like carbon offsets, carbon credits. You commodify the atmosphere, what's left of it even more. And now we're being told you can do the same with biodiversity. We turn biodiversity into carbon sinks. So the linkage is very, very, very strong. But the solutions more and more is to use what's left of public money internationally and nationally to subsidize another round of private, wrong solutions and profiteering. I think that's true. We need to understand it in a more structured way. Thank you.
Anyone else want to weigh in there? Oh, go ahead, Jess, please.
Okay. Thanks, Yokling. I think the question also asked, like, if the tools of decarbonization, that there are different tools, and I'm thinking here about some tensions, and actually Thea knows a lot about these tensions too, especially in this sort of recent boom around critical minerals or transition minerals that are seen as essential for decarbonization. So I think there are like strategies for decarbonization and climate policies that really incentivize those strategies that are very much in tension with biodiversity, probably obvious to many of you, but just for example, one of the first sort of so-called critical mineral mines was just approved in the Yukon, so in northern Canada, completely opposed by the Kaska Nation there. They do not want it because of risks it poses to caribou populations that are very important to their nation. So I think that there are indeed like tensions, right? These are not the same problem. And we've seen that strategies for decarbonization, including offsets like forest plantation. So there are these tensions in the strategy side, but I think what Thea said at the beginning, and others have said too, that these root sort of economic forms are indeed both need to be in our sights in both crises together.
Thanks so much, Jess. I'll pose, I guess, one more question for now to the group. And so this gets a little more at the institutional level, but one of the audience members would like to know what the kind of ideal, well, current, probably not so ideal, and possible more ideal roles of multilateral development banks might be, and what the specific recommendations you have for these banks' practices and policies, and whether they could potentially play a salutary role, for example, in reforming some of the subsidies that you know, as Fidel talked about, like discriminate against global South agricultural self-sufficiency, global North subsidies, that is. So just what kind of role multilateral development banks might play to alleviate some of these structural constraints?
I'm happy to chime in quickly on this question. So the multilateral development banks, the regional, but also the bigger ones, the World Bank in particular, they can accelerate with more climate finance, quote unquote climate finance, the structural entrapment that I described, and can accelerate the problem. But they can also, you know, redirect. It's really about what do you do with the money, right? So are we going to, you know, promote more strategic investments in agroecology and food sovereignty in the global South to restore food sovereignty, to restore biodiversity, and to regenerate truly sustainable economic activity in agriculture? Are we going to invest in more green hydrogen production to produce fertilizers in a country like Kenya, where I am today? And those fertilizers are going to go to producing more tea and coffee for exports, to accelerate the cash crop production, which is unfortunately what most multilateral development banks are looking at. They're looking at how can we help a country invest in agriculture so they can export more, so they can have more dollars, so you can stabilize their debt level. And no regard to the structural traps that's been set up since the early days after independence in Kenya and other places. Multilateral development banks can invest in renewable energy, and they are doing quite a bit more over the last few years. But renewable energy to deliver to the 650 million people on this continent who have no access to electricity, or to deliver electricity to Europe via, you know, green electricity exports and green hydrogen exports. These are the questions that the multilateral development banks are not answering properly, because they see countries in debt. They say, you have renewable energy potential, we're going to invest, you're going to export, you're going to have dollars, and you can stabilize your debt, with no regard to the millions of people who have no access to energy. And no country can function without food, without energy. And these are the two basic pillars that multilateral development banks have systematically destroyed in the global South, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Kind of seeing if organizers want to give me a cue if we have time for one more question or not, or if I should wrap up and move forward. Oh, sorry, I can't quite tell. But okay.
I think we could probably do one more if it was quick.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I will ask the final question, just because it hopefully lands us in a more I don't want to say positive, but I guess a productive kind of note about moving forward. And there are actually a couple of questions that hit on this theme of like what is to be done, perhaps. But And of course, there were just some great policy and institutional suggestions. I think there's a question broadly about how solidarity, and I'm just going to kind of mash up another question, how kind of global South solidarity, there's a lot of return to thinking about the new international economic order, which was a big proposal from the 70s that never saw its full flourishing for the reasons that we're talking about today, but remains perennially kind of relevant. And so I think there are questions like, how can solidarity both within countries, between different groups and broad coalitions, but also maybe across countries, could provide some leverage for global South governments, but also societies in addressing some of these kind of structural power imbalances. So yeah, what is the role of solidarity, of collective action, both maybe within states, but also transnationally, perhaps, if anyone wants to speak to that big but important question.
Well, I can go really quick. When I was doing this research and I was studying Jamaica and the bauxite industry in Jamaica, and actually just really related to the neo moment, actually bauxite, the Jamaican government actually attempted and did create actually a coalition of bauxite producers in an attempt to like kind of increase their political and economic power in a moment of the sort of decolonial moment at that time. And so they were trying to get other global South and other producing countries of bauxite to work together in order to increase their take from the industry. And unfortunately, as you can imagine, the story in the 70s, it was derailed through the pressures of the financial system, in fact, the oil shocks and things like that. But it's an interesting model. The idea of creating solidarity across sort of commodities as well, and we were inspired by it when we were reading at the time. But I'm sure others have other much more inspiring and recent answers.
No, that's great. I think that history of attempts to coordinate among commodity exporters is actually quite relevant. But let me pass it over to Fidel, who wants to add something.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, this year we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the new international economic order and all that tradition. And there's a lot of discussion about how do we seize the moment, because now everybody's panicking about access to strategic minerals, because it's the basic input for, everything for the next century, whether it's consumer electronics or military or renewable energy infrastructure. And that puts the global South, which is home to the vast majority of these strategic minerals, in a key position with a small window of opportunity, maybe in the next few years, to reposition itself away from the bottom of the global value chain. And what we've learned from previous attempts of countries getting together and trying to, climb up the value chain, a couple of notches, is that you can't really industrialize if you just have the first 2 or 3 notches of the value chain and you're missing the rest of it. And you can't industrialize alone. So that makes global South unity and solidarity not just a nice fluffy thing we say to each other in nice meetings, but a geopolitical and economic imperative. And that needs to be understood by not just civil society and think tanks, but at the highest level of political decision-making in the global South, which means forming regional blocs that have the complementarity of resources and capabilities and have enough of a geopolitical weight to force joint ventures, to force transfer of technology, which has been the main impediment for industrialization from the global North. And if the global North is not willing, there are other options today, which is China. China, for example, has the entire value chain of manufacturing renewable energy infrastructure. So is there an opportunity for joint ventures, repositioning of the global South via the G77 plus China group in order to change the balance of power, change the geopolitical game with the global North? Because at the end of the day, this is a question of power. And we've known it for a long time. And if you have, candid conversations with senior officials in the OECD about this, they'll tell you nobody in the global South is allowed to industrialize without our approval. So we know this. We have a small window of opportunity. We need to form these regional blocks of global South partnership and actual geopolitical repositioning using the small window of opportunity that we have. And I'm happy to say more in other circles. Thank you. Very good question.
Thank you so much. I think, as everyone can tell, there is kind of so much more to talk about today. All of these could be, much longer conversations, and we hope that the report kind of stimulates those conversations in all sorts of settings. So I want to just put in a plug for an event this evening, and then I'll pass it over to Audrey to kind of close us out. I'm not even going to attempt to summarize everything that's been said, because also the panelists have already been so synthetic, and we're kind of reaching time. But I do want to note another kind of crisis that the biodiversity and climate crisis intersects with, which is the genocide in Palestine right now, which there's been actually a lot of incredible research that's come out recently showing how ecocide and the climate crisis and militarism are intertwined with one another, and how that's relevant to what's happening right now. So there's an event being put on this evening, and it's in-person event, but it has a hybrid element, so anyone can join via Zoom, called Palestine and Climate Justice, Militarism as a Driver of the Climate Crisis. So I really recommend that folks attend that. We're putting the link in the chat to join the webinar. It's at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. And I think that many folks in this room would probably be interested in attending that. And it's a quite urgent issue, especially on this day or day 2 of this horrific invasion of Rafah. And I just really encourage folks to get involved and to make those connections between the climate crisis and genocide and militarism. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Audrey to close us out with some final points here. And I really appreciate the wonderful attendance and amazing questions and amazing thoughts from our panelists.
Great. Thanks, Thea, for moderating, and thank you to all of our panelists, and also the CCJ staff who have been running this from behind the scenes and making sure everything is working well. So my job today is just to tell you about our next steps and invite you to participate. So we intentionally did not include recommendations at the end of this report, in part because we understand that we need to be kind of engaging a lot more broader audiences around this. We need to be talking to folks who work on agriculture and debt and tax and climate, and be thinking together about how we can move in similar directions if we're going to be able to address any of these big barriers that we've just laid out here. So our next step from this report is to convene a series of what we're kind of calling focus groups to bring people together from various sectors, different organizations, different ideological positions, and to talk about how they understand these barriers and what opportunities they see in their own work or from their own viewpoint. And so we've just put the link in the chat, and we want to invite all of you to sign up for these focus groups if you feel that you have something to contribute or to learn in this way around kind of organizing around these issues. And this is a really important moment to do this, in part because the next Convention on Biological Diversity meeting will be held in Colombia this fall, Colombia being a government that has been kind of open about what impacts these debt crises, among other fiscal economic crises, have on taking action on nature and climate. And so we think this is a really important opportunity, and we just want to make sure that we can connect with everyone who's here and keep these conversations going, and try to learn from each other. And yeah, maybe eventually produce some kind of next steps that we can be pushing forward together. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I think we are wrapping here, but we'll leave it open for a moment so that you can get in that link that was just put in the chat. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.